everybody. I'm glad to have you here today. We are going to be talking about the revolution in recruiting that we've seen over the last 20 years, or not seen over the last 20 years. What's interesting is you go back to '99 and you look at the money that's been invested in this space. Over $2 billion has been invested in talent acquisition companies over that period of time. We've seen SaaS and mobile technologies really completely change the game in recruiting tech. People can apply for jobs through job boards or employee portals. Recruiters can find candidates through LinkedIn. And in spite of all this, it's still incredibly difficult to find great candidates. Employers are still having trouble just filling positions, much less filling them quickly, cost effectively, and with high quality candidates. And the candidates themselves, to the extent that they have anything to say about the experience that they have, it's somewhere between unpleasant and hateful. So, what's gone wrong? What needs to go better with recruiting technology? And how can we kind of fulfill the promise of the past 20 years? So here to answer that question, I have a very distinguished panel of guests. I'm going to let them introduce themselves really quickly. Daniel, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Daniel Chait. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Greenhouse.
Hi, I'm Josh Nestor. I'm the Education Director for Seek Limited.
Mark Newman, founder and Chief Customer Officer of HireVue.
Neil Frye, Head of Recruitment, HR Operations and Technology at Dropbox.
Hi, I'm Tamar Elkeles. I'm the Chief Talent Executive at Atlantic Bridge Capital.
All right, welcome guys, and I'm Steve Smith from the Starr Conspiracy. We're going to kick off the first question by talking kind of about the current state of recruiting, and since he has home field advantage, we're going to let Mark Newman answer this first question. What do you believe the role of recruiting is in the talent management lifecycle, and what's broken about it now?
Yeah, it's what the role is versus what they should be, right? On that part of it. Personally, I think the only reason why recruiters exist is because everyone generally sucks at recruiting, right? And just like how you want a neurosurgeon to do brain surgery, and because no one should be a brain surgeon, people are like, I guess we'll invent this thing called a recruiter. Right. And on top of that, though, it's just dismal because 30 to 50% of a recruiter's time is spent on activities that just they shouldn't have to do, right? Chasing after managers, getting feedback, scheduling interviews, getting rec approvals, all these kind of various elements. So it's not like actualized work that you're just excited about and engaged about. And so as a result of that, they're just the brunt of, they just get unleashed on with all sorts of just terribleness. Why are my jobs? Why are my jobs filled? Where are my rec? Why haven't you done this? Why is my rec not more important than that guy's rec? That guy's, all these kind of various elements. I want this candidate, you name it. So I think it's a real thankless job. And that needs to change because we're not building a generation of amazing recruiters that are going after it. It's becoming more and more thankless because they're so overloaded with everything. That's how I think the dismal state of affairs is, if it want to sound so terrible.
Well, Tamar, Neil, since you're on the practitioner side, how do you weigh in on that?
Well, I'll just kind of say originally that I was at Qualcomm for almost 23 years. I started there when there were 700 employees, and I was there until about a year and a half ago when there were 31,000. So I saw tremendous scale. There were times we were hiring about 100 people a week. So I saw what it was to really recruit, and I think the best recruiters are hiring managers, not going to the outside, but re-recruiting their current talent and being brand ambassadors. And I think that's how the evolution of recruiting is happening today, is that we really have a generation of people who are going after their friends and who are looking at social media to be able to make decisions about where they want to spend time. And I think the relationship today between the potential candidate and our employees is different than it used to be, and I just don't think that we as HR professionals have caught up.
Everyone's in recruiting.
Everyone's in recruiting, right? Well, you think about it when we're kids, we're recruiting on the soccer field who's going to be on your team, right? I mean, we had those skills at one time. It's all about, how do you want to get the right team around you to be able to help you win?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes we stand in our own way as HR professionals to the extent that we design technology or implement technology around the process that we've
Right.
built. And oftentimes when it was in the absence of it. And so I think only in the recent years have we started actually designing technology or configuring technology with the users in mind, whether those be the hiring managers, the candidates, or our employees. And so for me, it's that mind shift in both process design and then ultimately how we leverage the technology that is trying to keep up with all the moving pieces. But it's a challenge.
Well, Daniel, I was wondering, there's a lot of talk about kind of user experience and candidate experience, employer brand. A lot of these terms are kind of getting thrown around these days. Some of them are bordering on cliche. What's your take on how much these factor into the conversation, or maybe part of the problem?
Well, vendors love and analysts love buzzwords,
Right.
right? So every couple of years, there's a new buzzword for a candidate experience, whatever these words
HR
are,
people
right?
love buzzwords too.
Everyone loves buzzwords, right? So, you have to kind of like put that aside a little bit. At the end of the day, I think what these guys talked about is really true. Is like the whole company recruits people. And so the game of recruiting and hiring is really kind of the frontline engagement with people. And that takes a lot of different formats. It's not just like what the back office people inside of your recruiting department are doing. It's your employees who are, out with friends talking about how great it is to work at their company, and sharing, their friends, contact information with their internal teams, and keeping an eye out for new openings after they leave the company. It's the focus and care that they give when they show up to an interview with someone, and paying attention to, how am I doing a good job at actually focusing on this person's strengths and weaknesses, as opposed to just kind of like twiddling my thumbs or asking brain teasers and trying to get out of the meeting on time. So there's a whole set of practices that goes on, and most of it is not within the back office recruiting, and it's not really about your website. That together, that's the stuff that people experience when they're a candidate. That's the stuff that matters.
Well, so, that cultural aspect of recruiting, it seems like companies who are good at talent acquisition understand it, and it's just sort of in their DNA. And companies that don't get it are trying to solve the problem with, a new shiny object.
I think that's right, but I think it's not magic. I don't want to, it's in their DNA. That kind of sounds like, well, geez, Google can do it, but we can't, right? You hear that a lot. It's like, well, of course, but they're Google. It's like, well, no, any
But
company,
Google built a brand.
they focus
and they
on it.
communicate about a culture.
But they do actual stuff.
Yeah.
It's like Dropbox does actual stuff to get people. So when people complain, oh, geez, I can't hire because Dropbox is this hot startup that hires all these good people. It's like, no, they do different stuff than you do, and it works. Do that stuff.
Do you do
Right?
something to help
Yeah, it's
recruiting? Well, no.
it's
Okay, solve the problem.
I just feel like, you talk to lots of recruiters, and there's this very hopeless feeling that kind of emerges where it's like, oh man, what are you going to do? There's not enough candidates out there. And it's like, well, yeah, it's competitive, but lots of stuff is competitive. And you never hear salespeople going whew, man, it's like, there's no customers out there. What are you going to do? They all have a product. It's like, well, yeah, your job is to go out there and create the opportunity and sell the product. It's kind of the same thing.
It's that shift from, I think, recruiting in particular, particularly during times of higher supply, or the product is in a hotter space, become kind of talent cultivators. They get really good at kind of creating a process that we can bring folks along. And if you're lucky, you create a great candidate experience. But then when times get hard, like I think we saw in 2016, particularly for us as a startup, I oftentimes like to say we lost a little bit of our rainbow as a unicorn. I had to help the recruiters shift to become more seekers, talent seekers, people who could activate passive candidates, people who could speak more about what the differentiators were and why Dropbox was different, and then ultimately close them. And oftentimes those candidates had 2, 3, 7 offers. And so those skills of activation and closing are very different, are ones that you have to invest in the people and developing.
It's like the best recruiters are the ones that had to convince a developer to move from San Francisco to Columbus, Ohio, to join some bank to, do this part of it, because you're like, you did hard things. You didn't just spend $40,000 on perks and buses and food and whatever to try to get them in the door.
Yeah, it's not that. I mean, the number one reason that an employee stays in an organization today is for career growth. And so you've got to have that career growth value proposition out there for them. Otherwise, they're not coming. It's not money that differentiates. It's manager quality and can I build my career here? And back to the point that you were making earlier, Daniel, for the next generation, and as we think about millennials that are coming, it's really about, can I change the world, right? They want kind of a purpose-driven company. They want kind of a social message. And so you need to bring that to them. It's interesting at Qualcomm, we were designing chipsets. How exciting is that, right? We're competing really hot to design chipsets. And so these engineers are coming from all over the world to design a chipset that goes into your phone, kind of like Intel Inside, right? It's not a consumer product. It's B2B. It's very hard. And so we used to talk with the engineers about, what is it that's the secret sauce at Qualcomm? And a lot of it was the culture. A lot of it was manager quality. It's a place where you can grow your career. And we also tried to draw a bigger linkage. Like, we're not about designing chipsets. We're about making distance disappear. Making distance, yeah. We enable mobile communications, wireless communications. We enable that kid on the playground to be able to call their mom. We enable a child who's in Algeria to be able to talk to their mom in San Francisco. We enable a grandmother to keep in touch with their grandchildren around the world. We make distance disappear. And when you kind of create that bigger purpose, that's a key piece for attraction.
Well, and going back to kind of the touch point about the hiring manager, being that kind of entry point into the hiring process, is some of the difficulties that organizations have now the fact that most hiring managers suck at hiring?
Yeah, I think you already said that, didn't
Yeah,
you? You said everyone sucks at hiring.
No, the worst one is, like, if you built cars the way you hire people, literally you'd come off at the end of the line, you'd put the ignition in, you'd hope at first it doesn't blow up. And like 50% of the time it would start, right? And then you'd kind of have to push it off, and then people would be like, what happened to that car? Be like, we don't talk about that one. But this other car that does run, we all talk about, take credit for that great car, and it's like, you all take credit for the great hire. It's not so much that hiring managers suck at hiring, it's that they think, when you think you're great at something, but in reality you're only good 50% of the time, right? Like, that's really, really bad. And so that's the conflict that ends up driving that bad behavior. Going back to your part about like what candidates are looking for and how they're kind of thinking about it and their role in it, we do work with the federal government, and one of the heads of the intelligence agency in 1955, when it was first being established, came and said, we're dealing with a crisis in post-war America. Because there is no longer evil on the other side for us to fight. Like, that purpose disappeared, right? We're done with World War II, the purpose has disappeared. And when we did our research, it found out that people wanted the ability to advance, they wanted to care about their work, they wanted to take care of their family, they want to do that part of it. And so we keep coming back of like, oh, aha, people care about the work and the mission and all this part of it. It's like, no, it's always the same basic human need. And so managers, they show up and they're like, well, I need somebody, so you go get somebody to have them show up, and I'll kind of do that part of it. And it's like, no, everyone's in this. Everyone has to do this part.
One of the ways that type of behavior and thinking really shows up, like organizationally, one of the sort of like early warning signals is how you treat employee referrals.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that you sort of have to do when you're trying to hire someone. So that stuff tends to like be the last stuff to go. But like if you refer a friend and the person gets interviewed and the company kind of decides not to move forward with the person, do they ever go back to the person who made the referral and let them know? Or do you find out from your friend that they were rejected? Or if they get an offer, do you find out from your friend that they're getting an offer? Like, once you've taken the referral from your employee, there's no like forcing function making you go back to that employee and like thank them for the referral, update them on what's happening, like continue that conversation. And so a lot of teams that are just kind of treading water, they don't do that. That's one of those like level 0 behaviors, and then as they get more mature, more sophisticated, and they think about, well, this is a long-term process and this is a brand that we're trying to build and a human process, then you can see that some of these like, more human elements come into it.
Yeah. Well, Josh, I had a question for you kind of along those lines is, there seems to be a bias among some recruiters toward the idea of the passive candidate. We only want candidates who aren't actually in the market for a job, and candidates that are actually active and applying for jobs, there must be something wrong with them, so we want to deprioritize them. Has that hurt the candidate experience irreparably, or?
I think a lot of recruiters might send that signal to employers, but I don't actually agree with the premise. So maybe a bit controversial, and others might disagree. But In our business, we have both. We have really large job boards in a bunch of countries, plus we have large talent databases. So we allow employers and recruiters alike to choose. Do they place ads or do they use our talent databases or both? And then what we do is we survey people, our audience, but others as well, via sort of random online panels, and we ask them basically where did they get their last job. So it's a placement question, and we're really trying to understand share of placement across different channels. What we find is that we in a market like Australia, we deliver about 1 in 3 placements. That's across all online and offline channels, and LinkedIn deliver about 2 or 3%. And so what we infer from that is that active job seekers are still by far the most valuable source of candidates, of serious kind of candidates for roles. The other thing is that recruiters are amongst our largest and most active advertisers, right? So they're placing huge volumes of job ads, really significant share of our revenue. So they're acting with their wallets, so to speak, in that sense. I guess it is true though that they are using, so recruiters are using talent databases in droves. That's clearly they're very, very active. And on the whole, if the question is more about how are their biases coming through that process, there are obviously recruiters that are overzealous and or worse, doing sort of the wrong thing by candidates or not handling the candidates with respect. But overall, I think from a candidate perspective, they value being approached. It actually really signals to them that they're valuable. It validates their market value, and most importantly, I think it actually maintains their leverage. And so often, applying for a job can send too strong a signal for some candidates, and so they want access to a range of softer signals. And being approached is ideal because then they can maintain and maximise their leverage. There are other ways we try to sort of manage the biases of recruiters. So we try to omit names and certain other identifying characteristics, just to try to help manage some of those biases that inevitably creep into the system.
Yeah, just add a couple things. I mean, I think the passive candidate has driven us as recruiters and our recruiting functions to up our game. So I think it's been an actual good forcing function, whether it's from the candidate experience and making sure that it feels personalized, and that whether it's a reach out message from a hiring manager or that first message from a recruiter that feels personal. To the diversity topics, I think that you started to touch on, absolutely women engineers are gonna have a job. They are going to most likely be passive. And so we absolutely need to be able to engage with them and help share how our environments, how our career paths, how our value propositions, speak to them and will make them think about moving on. Because again, given the supply, they're just, all of them have jobs.
I don't know that I agree with that.
Yeah?
I don't think all of them have jobs. I think all of them want jobs. And I don't think all of them are in jobs that they want to have.
Yeah.
But I think there's a bigger pipeline out there
Yeah.
than we want to admit. And I think we have to do a much better job at getting more of them in. I think they're there.
The war for talent's totally self-induced,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's an enormous amount of supply of people out there that are capable,
Yeah.
and maybe they're not 100% fits, but they're like 85 or 90% fits,
Yeah.
and you could train them up a little bit, or you could get them into like your culture, and all of a sudden they're the perfect person that you
Yeah.
took a shot on.
Yeah.
I love you. Did you guys ever, from a practitioner side, did you ever see any data around difference of retention or performance between an inbound or outbound candidate? Someone that you guys engaged with versus that came to you, if there was ever a material difference?
We didn't look at the research on that, but that is super interesting.
We didn't see it at Google,
Yeah.
and we haven't done the analysis at Dropbox.
Got it. You didn't see a difference?
No.
Okay. All right.
I mean, one thing, Mark, to your question, one thing that we've seen is there's a difference at the top of the funnel, but if your process is good enough,
Yeah.
once they get past a certain couple interviews, then the candidate flow is kind of normalized.
Got it.
Well, you know,
If not, that's kind of a signal that your process maybe is missing something.
Right, like it's an elitist process, is this, we
Yeah.
did, you know, kind of
Yeah,
on
yeah,
that
yeah.
dynamic.
So ideally,
is,
you shouldn't, know, by the end, the candidate that made it through your interview and got hired should be fit to the standard.
Source agnostic almost.
Yeah.
Well, kind of moving on to talking about, you know, where there are opportunities to improve outcomes. You know, you've kind of played the data card and put that out on the table. And it seems like there's a lot of conversation about aggregating and analyzing data, but, you know, with so many organizations still having trouble hiring and seemingly being able to use this data, what do organizations need to do better immediately, and where are some immediate opportunities for improvement? Josh, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think firstly, you know, you're dealing with certain realities, which mean that regardless of how much data and how good the analytics are, you know, you're dealing essentially with a human problem. And so, you know, we sometimes align it to, you know, to dating, right? Finding a life partner. Finding the perfect candidate can be a bit like choosing a life partner, and probably the consequences can sometimes be, you know, as far-reaching for the company.
I think the difference is when you look for a life partner, you want to be looking for life.
Yeah.
When you look for a job today, people
Yeah.
are hopping pretty quickly. We don't want that for a life partner, right?
For sure, for
Right,
sure.
so it is a
there
little bit different.
So there certainly is certainly not, but you know, it's more that to reflect the fact that there are human factors involved,
Sure.
and things can get messy. I mean, the reality TV shows are built on this stuff. So that's one point. The other is there are certain market realities as well, right? There are demand-supply imbalances at play, and so. And then the third thing I think is that you know, companies are not flush with, or HR departments in particular are usually capacity constrained, time constrained. So and hence you know, are using recruiters out of necessity to kind of fill the gap. How employers and hirers can deal with that issue in some way is firstly making use of the tools that are available. In many cases, outsourcing to recruiters is not the right answer. There's a lot of tools that are available that can be used, and job boards, you know, we're job boards, I speak from that perspective. They look the same, but they're actually completely different to what they were even 3 years ago. You know, there's so many more tools available for you to be able to better find and match candidates, and just knowing what those tools are firstly. Secondly, having the time and space to be able to use them. And then thirdly, getting closer to the process, you know, because a lot of the time your interaction as a hirer with these products is through third-party software. And so actually getting closer to the process, both in terms of recruiters and in terms of the technology itself, allows you to actually take advantage of the tools that are there that weren't there before.
I have a different take on the answer to your question, which is like, what's the one thing people need to do urgently to get better? I think it's recruiters and HR people more generally learning to think in business terms. Too often you ask the question about data, HR people like looking at HR metrics,
Right.
but business metrics is what matters. And so, time to hire isn't what your company cares about. Your company cares about revenue, profit, earnings. And it constantly amazes me the disconnect when you talk to HR folks. I was having a conversation with a customer who said, I'm trying to advocate for a change in my organization, and I'm not getting through. The executives aren't really hearing me, and they don't really want to do anything about this problem. And the problem was that they were hiring 200 salespeople, and their failure rate on sales hiring was about 40 or 50%. I was like, huh. And you can't make a business case why that needs to get better. I'm like, what's your quota for a sales rep? It's like, $3 to $5 million a year per sales rep. Like, okay, this is kind of a meaty business problem you have on your hands. Like, it's worth solving. But when you think about it in terms of like hiring funnel metrics and like, geez, like how do I try to make a case that we should do a, employee survey, or we should like reduce time to hire? It's like, yeah, nobody cares about that stuff.
We're asking for an 18% increase in our
it's like-
cost per hire budget
like,
based
guys,
on this part of it.
It's like, you just told me that your CEO is throwing away like hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, go talk about that. I guarantee you'll get an audience.
Well, and part of the other problem is, from an HR standpoint, is that we're recruiting for positions that we don't even know exist yet, right? So we have a spec, but in reality, the market's moving so quickly, we don't know what that next job is. So we're really trying to do much more opportunistic hiring and hire pools of talent versus hiring a specific person for a specific job. We want to hire someone that's going to be with this company as long as possible and grow their career to be able to move into 5 different jobs within the organization over a lifespan. And I think that's partially what's hard too, is we've created so many HR systems that narrow people into a box. We're looking for this. I don't know, because next week our market may change. What we need might change. The skill set might change. New technology, disruption, all of that. Plus you have other things like the gig economy, where you have people taking on, they want shorter term jobs or more flexibility. And I don't think as HR professionals, we know how to deal with that either, right? Most of our laws and most of what we're hiring for is full-time or even part-time, but not this kind of project worker. And we haven't adapted yet our systems around that.
Or we don't own project workers. That's that's those other guys.
It's a different department.
And so I don't
right.
actually look at the whole talent supply of
Yeah.
who serves our
It's a
organization.
whole ecosystem.
Because marketing has their contractors, technology has their contractors, so-and-so
Right.
has their contractors. I don't have any view into that. I only see the full-time people. Like, that's actually one of the first things people could change from an organizational perspective, is allow recruiters to deal with some ambiguity. Like,
Yeah.
oh, there's 13 of the same job being posted, and I have 12 different recruiters holding those 13 jobs, and they fill their rec, but they don't actually look at it as a pool. Or, actually looking at what that talent is. And it's just a simple business process change around what do you have influence over or visibility to, that is one of the highest yields you could get to.
Yeah, Mark, there's a saying in product development, software development circles that, your product represents the org chart of the organization that built it. You can always see that coming through in the product. And in some ways, you could say that the company is sort of the product of kind of this recruiting process, and in a lot of ways reflects that. So by changing how you structure the team, you'll definitely get different result.
And what are the KPIs that companies and employers should be looking at in terms of quality? We've talked about, time to fill and cost per hire maybe aren't the strategic.
Retention.
Right.
It's
Is it all about retention?
You want to retain the talent.
Yeah, it's about it's quality in the sense of, who is in their role or at the company X period of time post-hire.
Who stays, who delivers.
So,
And then to a certain extent, a little bit about their performance, although again, I've run 10-year longitudinal studies on performance ratings to interview results. They don't correlate, FYI. But they're important, right? I mean, you absolutely, just over time, you need to look at people's performance. When there are issues with performance, find new homes for them. And again, it's why we should be not just looking at external recruits, we should be looking at internal mobility, we should be looking at contractor and contingent hiring, we should be looking at this as a workforce problem, not a candidate or recruit problem.
yeah, I think that's right. And I think ultimately the point is you're investing in human capital to generate value. So the first thing you should do is you should measure the value. We talk about employee lifetime value as a top level metric. Is like when you hire an employee, it costs some money, it makes an investment. That employee stays with you over time generating value and then leaves. You take the value they generated over that time and subtract away the cost it took you to get the person, and that's the net value of that investment. And so that's the top level metric, is you're trying to maximize the lifetime value of your human capital base.
And then you need to look at your customer feedback. That's candidates, that's hiring managers, that's people who are participating in your process. Those should be measured and reported on and set as goals for your team. And then their engagement. So the engagement of the actual recruiting team. What does that look like, both in terms of the metrics that drive their performance and their productivity, but also how they represent the brand out in the marketplace.
I think there's a probably useful distinction here to make as well when you talk about metrics. I mean, you've done obviously a lot of work on this, Neil, but like there's kind of output KPIs and input KPIs. Mm-hmm. And so like I say output KPIs, these are like business value stuff. And then you can click down into that and say how many interviews they schedule, what's their productivity, and these sort of things. But it's like if you're talking about a sales team, you wouldn't measure them on like number of customer calls they did. Primarily, it's about revenue.
Right.
And then beneath that, if they're not hitting their revenue number, it's like, well, why? They're not making enough calls, or they're not closing enough deals, or they're giving too many discounts. But like your main measure isn't how many discounts or how many phone calls, it's like revenue. I think the same thing in terms of people is like, first thing is, are we delivering what the company needs
Yes.
to win? And then beneath that, as you're managing a recruiting team or an HR team, you can kind of look at sort of the operational inputs to that.
And I think it's really the combination between the recruitment and the onboarding, right? So people forget that onboarding is so important. Some companies do a really
First
good job.
90 days.
Yeah, first 90 days. I mean, once you sign the offer letter is
Zero.
when.
First week.
Negative
Yeah,
90
I
to
mean,
zero.
we created an app that we sent to all new employees on the day that they signed an offer. And it was, you get them in that honeymoon, which is the first couple of weeks before they actually come. That's your best time to give them all kinds of information because they are thirsty to go get it. So we created an app that gave them all kinds of information about the company, all kinds of benefits information to sign up for. Anything that you can provide before they come on the very first day really helps get them engaged and motivated, and it keeps them there. And then we did that for an entire year, not just 90 days.
Yeah.
Mentors are super important as well to keep people, and assign them a mentor day one. Sometimes it's from the business, sometimes it's also a peer. But it's really important to get them connected because unfortunately companies are network systems, and you've got to facilitate those networks. Otherwise people are gonna, it's organ rejection. You know, they're gonna continue, the organ's gonna be rejected in the company unless you really try to give them those mentors and you give them a really, really solid onboarding program.
That's right. I mean, I would argue that, oh, sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Well, if you go back to what you said before, I mean, if you want to look at the cynic's view around what the human capital life cycle is, it's onboarding, reboarding, waterboarding, and offboarding, right? Like, I mean, like that's like really like if you think about like the whole cycle here, right? And but the relationship though is, oh, you're new here, so we're going to treat you really well.
Right.
You've been here for a year, or you just moved internally to a new role. Well,
Shines
do you
off, yeah.
do you onboard again?
Yes.
Then, right? You know, and it's
Yes.
like you just went to a new role. You may have, just because you've been here doesn't know what you know, idea what the hell he's talking about, right? And so it's like this idea of like onboarding and reboarding every time there's a talent change, you know, and moving them in or the business changes, and how do you constantly reboard?
Yeah,
to
those
make sure.
transitions, every time an employee transitions is a big opportunity for failure. And I always look at that and I say it's HR's fault because we did not manage that transition well. Because they were a damn good employee, they were performing really well, and we're like, great, we're gonna put you over here. And it got broken, right?
So
What was it? Was it that person? No, solid performer, awesome. Then it's gotta be the manager, it's gotta be our responsibility to make sure they didn't know the team, they didn't know the job, we promoted them too quickly, whatever that is. I always took responsibility and said, our fault, so we've gotta transition people
So
effectively.
I'll take issue with that.
Good,
Maybe we can set up a little bit of a
let's go.
a brawl here. So I think that basically a functional manager has three responsibilities: their own line, whether it's sales, marketing, what have you, their financial responsibilities, like their P&L and their budget and so forth, and their people responsibilities. And so I think it's absolutely the manager's job to do these things. I think it's HR's job to provide tools and to support and to make sure that they have what they need to succeed at that. But I absolutely hold a manager responsible for failing to onboard an employee successfully. And I think it's worse, if you're in an HR organization where you feel that it's your responsibility, you're in deep doo-doo because you have no ability to really control that. You can't be accountable and responsible for those things when in fact you're not the one who's going to show up and onboard the person. You're not the one who's going to do the one-on-ones. You're not the one who's going to provide good coaching. The manager is or isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I take responsibility for it and accountability is I think that we are the ones that facilitate the transition. Yes, the managers have to be there to support, but I think HR does play a huge role.
Yes.
And I think they need to be accountable. There's systems and there's tools and there's processes and but we actually need to make it happen. The manager's responsible for the success of the employee, but we need to make that transition smooth. So
the
we
dynamic-
can take this outside out.
No, I think the dynamic that exists
Mark can tell us a
is-
good place to fight in Salt Lake.
Yeah, so actually, if you want to go on the other side of State Street, you go up to No, the dynamic here, sorry, Utah joke. The dynamic, though, that exists is, from a manager perspective, somebody moves internally, and you're like, oh, well, I assume you already know everything. Right, you know, so
Yeah.
and so you immediately jump into that specific job skills for that program or that specific changes, or oh, you already know how Salesforce works, or oh, you already know how, you know, all these elements, and that's when you assume that then people go into that valley of despair because you got recruited at the top of your game, and you start at the bottom and you move up to here, but we all know the career path is this, it's a squiggle line, so you get recruited here whether it's internal or external, and you want to jump to this next point, but there's always that squiggle line. Right? And when you're already in the organization, people already assume you have it all figured out, that you're well liked, that you know who to talk to or whatever. But you pretty much start back at zero. Maybe you start at like 20%. You don't start at zero, and that's a hard, expensive 20% that you earn and work through. But like that's where it breaks down.
Yeah, well, and then try to layer on a global move.
Right, for sure.
In a new culture and a new, It's absolutely a joint responsibility, so.
Thank you.
I'll help
Thank you.
mediate.
Oh, Neil.
All right, let's talk a little bit about future state and, you know, what's possible, what you see coming down the bend. And the first question goes to the practitioners there at the end of the stage. based on your experience, you've worked at some very large and effective talent organizations. What advice do you have on creating better talent communities, creating a better candidate experience, and creating better hiring outcomes?
I think one of the big things that we've seen success with is alumni networks and really cultivating that. I mean, we had a lot of boomerang employees, right? They left, they came back. But think about how you can utilize the folks that have retired that know your company culture, and also folks that are alumni that maybe didn't retire but went somewhere else, and see if you can continue to facilitate discussions and collaboration with them. They're a really good source of recruiting. They're a really good source of onboarding. The other thing that we did is we did a lot of research with employees and asked them 90 days after they left and then a year after they left, why did you leave and what could have kept you, and then would you come back? And we actually had external folks go and do that research. So we kept phone numbers and emails and reached out to people who had left, because at the end of the day, those people may fit back into your culture at some point, so don't lose sight of them. You were talking earlier about trying to keep that network. I think that's critically important. And I also think we need to figure out ways to address this flexibility issue. I think it's not just for women, but it's in general the next generation. They don't want necessarily these jobs that are 7 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night for 40 years. They want more flexibility, and so I think as HR professionals, we need to really think about how do we change the working relationship today, and I do think it's different.
Yeah, I'd say talent communities, it's going to be a combination of kind of a more marketing focus from recruiting, and that's developing a community, an online presence, a place where people can not only learn about your company and your products, but what the work looks like within your company, and fostering that over a much longer period of time than a general recruiting life cycle. And so creating that community, and then to your point, transitioning from that community into the internal organization in a seamless fashion. It also, the talent community speaks to the contingent workforce that we talked about. That talent community should be a place where I can find out not only where the full-time opportunities are, but where the project-based opportunities are. What do those look like? How does it feel? And how do I quickly engage in those if I can? From a candidate experience, again, it's going to continue to be very personalized. The future is about being able to describe the work that a person's doing, the impact that they're going to have, the problems that they're going to solve. Despite us trying to hire for people that are going to be at the company for 5+ years, people want to know exactly what they're going to do in the first 30, 60, 90 days. And so being able to arm our hiring managers, our hiring teams, the interviewers, the recruiters, everyone who touches or speaks to a candidate, those are the things that I think that they're looking for and that we're going to have to deliver on. And then ultimately, we're going to have to keep our recruiters and recruiting teams engaged. And so that's the career pathing. How do I progress? I mean, the smaller organizations, I'm either a recruiter or I'm a manager of recruiters. We have to differentiate the levels in which a recruiter or sourcer or program manager inside our teams sees their role maturing, evolving, the problems they're solving, et cetera, and be clear about what we're measuring them on throughout each of those steps in their career. Otherwise, they'll get restless and they'll move on. So,
Well, it's like there's no degree in recruiting. How do you end up in recruiting? You could have come from all walks of life. What's my path in recruiting? I don't know. Is it inside of recruiting? Is it out? Is it this? There's all sorts of dynamics there. It's not-
yeah, we talk about process optimizers, data analysts, candidate seekers / cultivators, and then really folks who are interested in more operations work. And we try to define those paths and have people at Dropbox kind of major and minor so that they can feel like they're invested in something while still kind of developing. It might be a 20% project that they do. It might be a shadow that they do over the course of a period, but it starts to give them those tastes of those other lives, and then depending upon where they want to go next.
Very cool.
Okay, next question is for the technologists on this end. What are the innovations that you're seeing out there that you're most excited about or think have the biggest opportunity to have a positive impact on recruiting?
Sure. So I think, to start with the amount, both the breadth and the depth and scale of digital information and data that's out there. I mean, we're only scratching the surface of it, but it's phenomenal. And when you couple that with, machine learning and AI kind of tools where you can start to unlock the value of that data. Working out what the right data to capture is really important, and kind of how to use it, how to package it is critical. But you know, we're seeing huge improvements already in a bunch of areas, but particularly around matching, right? So being able to match the right role to the right candidate at the right time we're seeing huge leaps forward in terms of effectiveness, firstly, and efficiency based on that basis. What that then kind of leads to is personalization, right? So the holy grail, if you like, is you know, being able to click a button and you get highly relevant jobs kind of served to you if you're a candidate, and if you're you know, a hirer, then having at the press of a button really relevant candidates kind of served up to you, and a clear delineation between the great ones from the good ones. And I think, you know, that's kind of the goal. So if you like, you know, looking forward 5 years, you can imagine you're being transported home in your driverless car, and you know, it's connected to the internet, and you're on your mobile phone and you're talking to Siri, and you're having a conversation about recruitment or about your career.
And it's a robot.
It's supposed to
You're
pick up your
recruiting a
sentiment
robot.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
mood,
yeah.
and it says, hey, you've had 3 bad days in a row. Is it time to find a new
Yeah.
job?
Absolutely.
And then that comes up on the screen
So,
in the 17-inch Tesla
Yeah.
to say, yes, we
Yeah.
already know how this works.
There you go, you got it.
Yeah.
We just have
That's
to,
right.
we can picture it, now we
Yeah,
just have to
exactly.
go to that
Yeah.
direction.
All sentiment analysis.
Well, on an earlier panel that Jean Meister was doing, she was talking about credentialing and some of the opportunities that organizations have to better identify candidates with certain skills. Between that and some of the up-and-coming kind of assessments that are being built into the recruitment process, is there a possibility or a likelihood that some of those biases or those indicators that recruiters and hiring managers focus on that don't correlate with success in a job role, that those things will kind of go away, and that by a result, you'll get a better candidate experience and you'll get better recruiting outcomes?
Yeah, let me tell you about HireVue. Here's our card. No, so just jump in there. No, ultimately, one of the biggest innovations that we're seeing, so HireVue was very early around machine learning and deep learning off of analyzing the video context for language and sentiment analysis and video and emotion and voice and tying it to performance outcomes and all this fun stuff. And it works really, really well. But the first thing that actually has to happen from an innovation perspective is 2 things. One, the acceptance that talent can come from anywhere, right? It isn't just a degree or a program or an experience. It's an acceptance that, you know, a developer at 22 years old or an anthropologist at 22 years old could actually be just as capable as each other, because one was coding since they were 12 and just doing it for fun, and the other went through a CS program and what have you. Talent can come from anywhere. But the second one, it's a massive innovation. It's the biggest secret to unlocking capability inside of organizations. It's actually knowing your data, right? Like, when everything was on-prem and everything was distributed, you'd be at these big organizations and it'd say, how many recs do we have open right now? And you're like, I have no idea. How many candidates do we get next year? Or last year? I don't know. What about prospects? What about this? Like, you had no idea what you were actually working with, and the data was so bad. Who stayed? Well, define stayed, right? You know, and this was so terrible that you were just hosed. And that's one of the biggest innovations we've seen, is that companies are finally getting their act together around at least knowing the data. It's like Maslow's hierarchy. They're getting security and food and water before they can even talk about anything else.
I think that's right, and I think as much as it's fun to talk about our self-driving cars and, you know, chatting with our phones, and I have a 5-year-old, I'm sure he'll live in that world. Like, the world we live in today, you know, so we started Greenhouse in 2012. It's been, you know, we're in year 6 now, and the difference between like the ecosystem that we exist in now versus just a few years ago is truly breathtaking. There's been, as you highlighted, huge investments in new startups, and the big difference I see is, like, we're in a much more open world. I mean, kind of to Mark's point, like in the old days, you had your CIO would buy kind of one big honking thing, and it would do everything pretty poorly, and you had to live with it forever. And now, you know, you can kind of pick and choose and pull together like a whole constellation of solutions. It all works together. It's all cloud-based for your sourcing needs, for your assessment needs, for your different workflow needs that you want for analytics, and then choose that stuff, you know, over time, take advantage of the best, you know, new innovations that are coming out. Like, that's happening today. And the most interesting thing about all that, for me, from my standpoint, is I think the big win in like the first generation of cloud software was very much record keeping. Like, Intuit took your checkbook and put it on the computer.
Right.
And like Salesforce took your Rolodex and put it on the computer. And like those are big businesses, they're great, right? But like now,
PeopleSoft put your records on
yeah, it's like took your social security number in the computer. But like now it's all in the computer. So now like today's cloud companies, like Dropbox is a great example of this, HireVue is a great example of this as well, is like, what are you doing with that information? How are you going to be better at your jobs? And like today's companies have a much higher aspiration to help you perform better and achieve like better outcomes through software automation. And that's a great world that we're in, and it's there today. I mean, that's stuff that everyone's using right now.
See, I think we might have to go outside as well later because I'm feeling in the mood to disagree around the time frame. I think your 5-year-old, they might be looking for full-time work when they're 10, but I think this is 5 years away, not 10, 15. We're already 10 years into the smartphone revolution, and already it's having a significant impact. The acceleration, there's an amazing acceleration happening in the use of data and the use of AI, and the early successes are there and kind of fueling the investment. So we're doubling, tripling down on our investment in this based on the early results that we're seeing. So I think it's kind of 5 years away, not 10 to 15.
When you Google like AI and HR, the most common articles that come up are people being like, what can we use AI for in HR?
Yeah,
like that's like where the conversation is right now.
And frankly, I think if employers are left to do it on their own, then we're not doing our job.
Yeah.
So our job is to kind of enable employers to be able to free them up to do their work effectively by providing those tools in a very user-friendly way.
I had a kind of fleeting thought about this on the plane over here today, so this is like fresh off the presses here. But I think a lot of innovation traditionally comes at like small companies and startups and then moves its way up into the sort of enterprise. But I think a lot of the like machine learning concepts really only work and really only matter if you have lots of data.
Yeah.
So if you've made like 14 hires this year, you don't need big data.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
HR as an industry goes totally counter to every single tech company in the world, tech industry in the world. It's the biggest companies that adopt first.
That's right.
Because they have the biggest problem, and then it works its way down
agree with
compared to. Well,
Cool.
I agree.
So I'll throw my argument into the mix. I mean, I absolutely think data is important. We have to analyze it. But I think that oftentimes we view it as a panacea, that it will solve all ills. And 2, there are intrinsic biases in the algorithms that we code that mine that data. You can see it in the election results. You can see it in a lot of different things. We can program the smartest algorithms, and there'll still be some amount of bias in it. So I just think, I think we can't think that it's going to solve all ills. We need to continue to progress and continue to look towards those things, but it has to be one data point in many before we start making decisions on it.
Yeah.
And the data is important, but the fit is the most important. It's around their attitude. You can't train attitude, you can train skill set. So for me, that's still the piece that data doesn't give you, which is the culture fit with the person. How is that person going to fit with the team? What are the skill sets that they bring? From a diversity standpoint, is there diversity of thought, diversity of experience? And I think that's where you miss it on the data side.
And it comes back to the human factor.
Correct.
You kind of can't eliminate that from the process.
Correct.
Whether it be data-driven approach or a manual approach, you still have those biases. By the way, today that they'll continue to exist forever. Yeah.
Sure.
see, I actually think we could design bias-free recruiting. Because
Oh.
we've noticed.
Oh.
So,
In the last-
yes, we're going to throw this right in.
throws one
No.
in.
Have you guys got another hour?
So we,
I hope so.
because
I hope you
we
can.
define data as the traditional data that we've had.
Yeah.
Right? When we say data, we get our job postings, we get our resumes, we get our attributes in there, the things that we could Boolean search, and like we have this data that we have all that part of it. But when you're talking about the culture fit, when you're talking about that, well, actually, you can pull up a ton from the language that they're actually
Correct.
using and how that mimics the other, the personality
Yes,
styles.
but
and
people
that's part
still
of
want to
it.
hire people like them. and
Oh
that's part of the problem.
completely. But you could what we've seen is we can actually
Okay, now we're all going to
predict.
beat you up in the
So we can literally create a golf handicap off evaluator ratings because we're so we can pick off from the video that this person is mid-20s, blonde, good-looking, looks like he should be on a reality TV show, and that manager actually always rates that person 3 points higher. So do you want to correct that? We were like, yep. And I mean, it's already there
That's
because
cool.
the new data that you have available to you is different than the old data when we say data drives recruiting. So we could design bias-free recruiting.
Okay,
Convince
we're
you.
gonna have to leave it on that note.
We're gonna leave them do it. I want to see it next year.
And now we're gonna adjourn to the parking lot and rumble. So,
Red Iguana, there's also Red Iguana 2. It's just up on 600 North. If you're in Utah, you got to try it.
okay, everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.